Well, everyone, here we are, Chapter 7. This could be one of the most crucial chapters we're going to be taking a look at in this course because it's going to help you get some high-quality information for your speeches as well as help you to avoid any kind of legal trouble or plagiarism claims as you present out in the public. So let's just dive right in. When you do these speeches that are coming up, you really need to pay attention to the type of information that you put into them. You want to have some high quality information, some things that are really going to have a lot of value for your listeners. But the question comes up is, how do you separate the good stuff from the bad stuff? What does it take to be considered high quality? Well, if information is going to be considered high quality, it has to be factual. Is the information factual? Is it based on facts, not on hearsay, not on distortions, not on oversimplifications? Simply, is it a fact? Can it be verified? Is it reliable? Is that information you're going to put into your speech reliable? Does it come from sources that are trustworthy, that are considered authoritative? You need to find that reliable information and put it into your speeches. Is the information that you find well supported? Is there a lot of strong evidence? Is there examples? Is there statistics? Is there proof? Are these things well supported? Is it current? In other words, is it up to date? You don't want old information in a speech. You want the most current information that you can find to put into your speeches. Can it be verified? Can it be cross-checked against another source? Is there a large number of reliable sources that can actually back up and verify the claim that you want to use? Is the information fair? Does it come from unbiased or even-handed sources? Is it presented in a spirit of fair play? Is it fair? Things can be lopsided, and you don't want them to be. And the last is this: is the information you want to use comprehensive? Does it include all the relevant data and not just enough data to prove your side of the case? So finding high-quality information, you need to start thinking about all of these things. And if it doesn't meet one of these things, you may need to throw it out. Imagine that a magazine writer makes this argument. If teenagers have parents who are constantly unhappy and they're fighting all of the time, those teenagers are going to turn to excessive use of alcohol and drugs. Well, to back this claim up, the writer tells an anecdote about 3 troubled teenagers that he knows, and all of them had parents who fought when they were growing up. Has the writer actually proved their case here? Well, no, he hasn't. He's only used these things that we call anecdotes, which by themselves absolutely prove nothing. To prove his argument, he's going to need reliable studies by trustworthy scholars, and those studies need to involve hundreds of students, maybe even thousands. So if you're going to look for high-quality information, you must reject claims that are based solely on anecdotes. You don't want to use that information. You also need to reject any kind of a claim that is based on a testimonial, that is solely based on testimonials. You don't want to use these items of information in your speech if that is all that they are based upon. For instance, the writer of a book stated one time that the way to stop smoking is to go through a program of hypnosis. Now, she recounts all kind of testimonials from 5 different people who underwent hypnosis, and all 5 swear that hypnosis caused them to quit smoking for good. Well, has the writer succeeded in proving her point? Again, the answer is no, because hypnosis may have helped those 5 people. Their experience does not necessarily prove that hypnosis is a verifiable way to stop smoking for all smokers. More evidence is going to be needed, so you have to be careful when you use these testimonials. Another thing you also need to reject is using claims that are based solely on opinions. Imagine just for a moment, if you would, a speaker who argues sincerely and forcefully that women are temperamentally, I can't even say it these days, incapable of becoming effective leaders of a business team. And he says that he bases his argument on years of experience and observation in the business world. He defends his claim with the strong emotions surrounding it and an air of certainty because he's lived through it. Does his argument have any merit? Nope. You guessed it, because it's based solely on opinion. And even more so, it's his opinion. There's no evidence. Some speakers persuade listeners to accept their point of view because they are on fire with conviction. But strong opinions, unfortunately, do not constitute proof. So you have to stay away from claims that are based solely on opinions. Can you use opinions? Yes. But you have to use other sources to back up that opinion. One thing you can do is to find more than one source. It's a big mistake to limit yourself just to one source, because what if that source ends up being wrong? Let's take an imaginary example. For instance, suppose you're doing research and the first source that you come across is an expert who says that green is the most visible color for cars in terms of highway safety. But what if you stopped at this point? Unless you really investigated further, you would not find out that all the other experts out there say that red is the most visible color. You would actually end up giving your audience incorrect information. And that's true if you think about it. What's the number one color of a car that receives the most speeding tickets? You got it. It's red. They're the most visible. So make sure that you find more than one source. It's also correct to examine opposing viewpoints. You should find out everything possible about the viewpoints of other people who disagree with you or disagree with the point that you're trying to make. And this helps in a couple of ways. First, from an ethical standpoint, if you evaluate all sides of an issue, it might lead you actually to modify your own position. From a practical viewpoint, however, examining the views of opponents can help you anticipate the objections that some listeners might make to your own arguments. And so you can kind of dispel those arguments. You can kind of quash them before they even come up because you know the other side. You can design your speech to overcome these objections. And also you can plan what you're going to say if you have a question and answer period. You know what the opposite side of the argument is going to say, so you can be prepared to answer intelligently. Be very careful in using polls. These things can be skewed just by people wanting to save face. Think about the question you see on the screen. Did you vote in the last election? You know, a lot of polls can be unreliable because people they simply don't answer questions like this truthfully. For instance, after a recent election not long ago, pollsters found that 56% of American eligible voters who lived in America said that they had cast a ballot, that they had actually voted. But the actual election returns showed that only 39% had done so. What's up with those 17% who lied? You can see that polls sometimes can be skewed because people, they don't want to be embarrassed. You know, it's kind of embarrassing to say, no, I didn't vote. And so the poll can be skewed into a way that's not good for your proof, for your speeches. Now, this is an interesting one here. You have to understand that experts are experts, but there is a fallibility factor of experts. Just because someone has MD or PhD behind their name, does that automatically make them a trustworthy expert? To be honest with you, some MDs are con artists. They make a fortune of money selling products on websites and TV shows that are really worthless, kind of like those diet pills and vitamins that really you can easily get over the counter for much cheaper. Maybe they have a product or a therapy that they are trying to push, and they're making tons of money, and they do have a MD or PhD, but they're really doing it in the wrong manner. So you just have to understand that some PhDs even can write books with ridiculous notions because they know it's going to sell. In fact, there's a particular PhD out there who wrote a book and had this contention that the Nazis' murder of millions of Jews never even happened. Now, we know from history that it did, but this expert, quote unquote, wrote a book denying that claim. You have to understand that not every expert is 100% honest. You also need to be aware that just because you find a group with a cool sounding name, such as the National Wetlands Coalition, that group or that person may actually be misleading you. If you heard this name, the National Wetlands Coalition, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is a group of people who are concerned about preserving the wetlands of the United States. But the Wall Street Journal actually reported that the National Wetlands Coalition is financed by oil companies and real estate developers whose goal is to actually reduce the amount of wetlands protected by federal law. So don't take things just on face value. Do your research. You have to understand where they are coming from and if they are trustworthy enough to be used. Now, we're all going to turn to internet sites for information. Now, we talked about in some other lessons about how we shouldn't just solely lean on internet sites. We shouldn't totally just rely on Google. But if you are going to use internet sites for some information, here are some tips and pointers. You need to be sure that you're not going to be swayed by widespread dissemination of information. You see this pen here? There's a story going around that the American Space Agency, or NASA as we know it, spent $12 billion with a B dollars to develop a ballpoint space pen for astronauts that are working in zero gravity. In other words, they made this pen that would always write, no matter what side. Because, you know, sometimes if you turn a pen upside down, it loses the ink after a few minutes and you can't write. The rumor went around that NASA had spent $12 billion to create a pen that astronauts could write when there's no gravity. And this is absolutely false. Even though this was all over the internet, some people make these preposterous claims like this, and then their facts are challenged. And when their facts are challenged, they defend themselves by saying, well, it must be true. I read it on the internet. Well, widespread appearance of information on the internet is really no proof of accuracy. Unfortunately, this kind of misinformation can spread to all parts of the planet in mere seconds. And so don't be swayed. Just because you see a fact everywhere doesn't mean that it's actually factual. You also need to take care for this thing that we call web manipulation. Let's say you visit a website on how to take care of your car's exterior. You know, you got a new car, you're worried about it, you want to take care of it. It's got to last you at least 6 years until you pay that note off. And so you go to these websites, and the suggestions on the website look like objective, reliable material. They look like good sources. One of the tips that you come across is a web link that just simply says high-quality wax. If you click on the link and you go to the page, you can notice that that page is openly commercial. It's a website that actually sells exterior wax for vehicles. But unknown to you, the original page that you've been looking at and the wax page that you clicked into are both operated by the same source, a company that sells wax. The company has not really done anything illegal, but it has acted a bit unethically in leaving you with the impression that the tips page was written by some kind of impartial researcher who is honestly recommending the best product for your car. But you have been manipulated. And to avoid being manipulated, you have to kind of weigh all the advice that you see on the internet and the web and verify that the information is corroborated by sources that you know and that you can trust. So don't be misled. The web will manipulate you at times. Again, don't be dazzled by high-tech designs if you go to a website. We've got this thing in our culture that the more high-tech something is, or the more flashy something is, the higher quality that product must be. And that's not always the case. And so if you go into a website that is very well designed and very attractive, just because it looks good doesn't mean the information that is located on that website is actually good or high-quality information. You also need to investigate sponsors and authors. If a website is up and you're considering using information, find out who actually sponsors the website. Is it a company website? Who put the website together? Who's the author? Find out the author's credential. Find out their background information. And if you want to, if it's not clear from the website, send an email. Ask for the credentials of the person who is making these claims. You have the right to do that. In fact, you have a responsibility to do that to your audience, to make sure that the information you're using is high quality. Now, we're going to kind of switch gears here for a moment. We're going to talk about plagiarism. This is a topic that we don't talk a lot about in public speaking because we think about plagiarism only having to do with the written works, say an English paper, that you're turning in or a report that you're going to turn in. We worry about plagiarism there, but the truth is plagiarism does spill out into the public speaking realm. Plagiarism basically means taking someone else's words, their ideas, their images, or any other content that someone produces, and then pretending that it's your own. People may not realize this, but plagiarism in public speaking is a big deal. It's true that some college presidents, some ministers, and business leaders have all lost their jobs because they gave speeches that contained plagiarized material. You need to stay away from plagiarism. And we're going to look at a few different types. The first is wholesale copying, and this should be pretty evident to you. If you copy an entire work or a section of a work and you make no changes, or maybe just a few tweaks, a word here, a word there that you change, you are actually guilty of blatant theft. And you're thinking to yourself, but what if I give credit? What if I give credit to the person who originally wrote it or the original source? Doesn't that make copying acceptable at that point? The answer is absolutely not. Because even if you do give credit, you're still misleading your audience into assuming that what they are hearing and the basic structure and wording of what you're saying is actually your creation, but it's not. There's only one exception to that rule, and you probably can guess what it is. If you have a quotation from someone, that's not plagiarism. If you're quoting someone, but that's brief and it's small, it's not wholesale copying of information and passing it off as your own. The second type of plagiarism that some people are guilty of, whether writing or speaking, is that they cut and paste different pieces of material from several different sources and they kind of put them together into one speech. And again, if you're taking a sentence or two from this side and a paragraph from this side and 2 or 3 sentences from another site and putting it all together, you're still plagiarizing. Even if you give credit to the various sources, you're still committing plagiarism. Your audience thinks this is your thoughts. The audience believes that you are saying this, and that's plagiarism. The third type of plagiarism is when you paraphrase someone and you do it inappropriately. Now, you kind of know what paraphrasing is. It's basically taking someone else's material and you basically restate it in your own words. Now, this is a legitimate way to report what others have said if you give credit, but some people paraphrase improperly by sticking too close to the original. For example, they go through a document and they replace important words with synonyms. For instance, freedom becomes liberty and persuaded becomes convinced, and then they pretend that the material is their own creation. Now, it's true that they have abstained from wholesale copying by doing that, but their style of paraphrasing constitutes plagiarism because, again, they retain the overall organization of ideas and the basic sentence structures of the original author. And as with other forms of plagiarism, inappropriate paraphrasing does not become acceptable as speakers give credit to the source. You're still deceiving your audience. And remember, when you do public speaking, you have to keep a high standard of ethics, a high standard of morals, and inappropriate paraphrasing violates those things. Now, to be honest and fair, you should reveal to your audience where you get your information and where you get it from. And this revelation is more than just a way to protect yourself from accusations of plagiarism. You're actually demonstrating that you're a trustworthy researcher who wants to give credit where credit is due. So let's look at 5 different methods for giving credit to the sources that you come across. The first method is that you should give credit as you proceed through your speech. If you're going to be using someone else's information, you need to give maybe some oral footnotes while you go along during your speech. For example, you might say something like, according to the CBS Evening News on March 15th of this year, and blah, 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 whatever you want to say. Or you could say, the Wall Street Journal last month reported, and blah, 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 and finish out your thought. Those are just kind of these oral footnotes that you can give. So give credit as you go through your speech. The second method is essentially giving global credit in the introduction. After you grab your listeners' attention, you get that attention material, and you give them some orientation onto where you're going, you can provide an overview of all the resources that you're going to be using in the body of the speech. For For example, you can say, all of the information in this speech comes from a book, Wind Power, by energy researcher Paul Gipe, an article in National Geographic published in April of this year, and a recent email interview with Christina Archer of Stanford University, one of the world's top experts in alternative energy. You've given global credit in the introduction, and that will give you some credibility as you proceed through the speech. The third method is you can display a slide or a poster listing your sources. Now, if you use this method, don't put all of your bibliographical details in here, such as publisher of a book, because the slide or poster is going to become too wordy and no one's going to read it. It's going to be distracting. But you can make one of these, a slide or a poster that just gives credit to your sources. That's totally acceptable. The fourth method of giving credit is providing a handout that lists your sources. A complete list of your sources with full bibliography details can help listeners go back and see that you are actually a credible researcher. They can go back and check, and it establishes your credibility in a bunch of ways. Your handout should be distributed at the end of a speech, though, so that you don't distract anybody with your handout. And the last method we're going to take a look at is to display all the books and articles and photos on a table for your audience to actually come up and look at. For instance, if you're doing a speech on slave auctions in the United States before the Civil War, you can put out all of your research materials, including reproductions of like slave for sale posters or books or articles. And afterwards, your classmates or your audience can actually come up and kind of thumb through them at the end of class. That way people know where you got your information. So far, we've talked about plagiarism, and that's really an ethical issue. But sometimes this form of stealing can actually be a legal issue as well. And this is known as copyright infringement. Now, you've heard that term before. Under U.S. and international copyright laws, you are subject to a prison term or a fine, listen to this, of up to $100,000 if you are found guilty of stealing intellectual property. And I don't know about you, but I don't have $100,000 to be risking and putting on the line. Well, I don't even have $100,000, but whether it's printed material or you use a photograph, a video, or a song, before you use any of these materials in a presentation or placing it in a handout, you have to get permission. And in some cases, you may even have to pay a fee for it. Now, there's some exceptions to this rule, and we're going to look at those. The first is that there are certain items out there that are considered public domain. You don't have to get permission. You don't have to pay a fee if the material is in the public domain. The public domain refers to material that is owned by the community at large. It's unprotected by any patents or copyrights, and anything that is published or created before 1923, well, that's in the public domain. And you're free to use it in whatever way that you want to or wish. For example, if you're looking for drawings of Niagara Falls in a 1920s encyclopedia, well, you can use that in a handout, or you can make it into a slide. That's not always the freshest information because that's almost 100 years ago, but that is free for you to use because it's in the public domain. There's also the fair use clause. You don't have to ask permission or pay a fee if the material falls under this thing called fair use. This is a loophole in copyright laws, and it basically covers you as a student. It covers scholars, journalists, students, and others to use small, let me get that right, small, reasonable amounts of a work without having to spend money or time securing permission. And to use the fair use loophole, you have to meet three conditions. First, you can only use a small and relatively insignificant portion of a copyrighted work. The second thing is your purpose is primarily educational rather than commercial. You're not going to be selling this work. And number three, you don't cause economic harm to the copyrighted work. In other words, you don't disparage them if they are getting paid for the material. Student speeches fall under the fair use, which is why you can use photos from the internet, you can use videos, you can use music, you can use all of those things as a student in the classroom. Now, however, if you create a speech in the classroom and you take it out and you're going to deliver it in the public domain, you no longer fall under the fair use. So be careful with that. And the last part is this exemption is this royalty-free material. To avoid fees and legal penalties. A lot of speakers and writers and editors are buying artwork, such as photos and drawings and multimedia works. People will grab music, sound effects, and videos that are considered royalty-free. That is, they're free of restrictions and fees. In other words, when you pay for a royalty-free product, you are buying the right to use it in a publication or a speech or a video production without having to ask the permission or to pay anything extra. For example, if you are producing a DVD for your company, you can use a royalty-free rendition of Beethoven's Symphony as background music. Now, most royalty-free material does cost, but once you pay that one-time fee, it's pretty much yours to use. Now, you have to be careful because every royalty-free company out there has different guidelines. You may be able to use it for one project, for 10 projects. You just go with their guidelines. But once you purchase the material, it's free to be used. You don't have to go back and keep paying a fee every time. So these are some really good thoughts to kind of ponder on when we consider how to avoid plagiarism, how to evaluate your information when it comes to having high-quality information. And this is going to help you come up with some awesome public speeches in the future.